She was young, vibrant, and full of life. At just 23 years old, Lauren Smith Fields seemed to have her whole future ahead of her. Known for her warm smile, ambition, and love for her family, Lauren had dreams that extended far beyond the city of Bridgeport, Connecticut. Her life was just beginning, until it wasn't. On what should have been an ordinary night, Lauren welcomed a guest into her home, someone she had only recently met. They shared drinks, laughter, and conversation. It was the kind of night many might consider routine. But by the next morning, everything had changed. Lauren was found unresponsive, lying still in her own apartment. Blood stained the scene. A single 911 call shattered the silence. And with that, a mystery began. What followed raised more questions than answers. Why wasn't her family notified immediately? Why did it take over a day for them to learn of her death? And what about the evidence later found by her loved ones? Evidence that, according to them, the police overlooked. A used condom, bloody sheets, an unidentified pill. Details that couldn't simply be brushed aside. The official reports pointed in one direction. But her family believed something was missing. They insisted Lauren wasn't a drug user. They questioned the conclusion. They wanted justice. As the days turned into weeks, the story spread, reaching far beyond the city's borders. Conversations ignited about race, justice, and the responsibility of those sworn to protect and serve. Tonight, we examine a case that has captured national attention, a case where trust in the system hangs in the balance. What really happened to Lauren Smith Fields? Was it simply an unfortunate accident, or is there a truth yet to be uncovered? As you watch, consider the facts, the contradictions, and the voices demanding answers. What do you think? Was this a tragic coincidence or something else entirely? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Lauren Smith Fields had no idea that the man she connected with on the popular dating app, Bumble, would be the last person to see her alive. Matthew LaFontaine, a name that would soon become central to a growing mystery. But who was he? And how did a casual online conversation lead to a night that ended in tragedy? According to reports, Lauren and Matthew exchanged messages for several days before deciding to meet in person. Their chat seemed harmless, typical back and forth between two people testing the waters of a potential connection. And so, they agreed to meet at Lauren's apartment. No crowded restaurant, no busy bar. Just the quiet familiarity of her home. It was a decision that would later be questioned by many. LaFontaine told investigators that the night started simply enough. Lauren asked him for $40 to get her nails done, a detail some would later scrutinize. He arrived at her apartment with a bottle of tequila, as she had requested. They drank together. They played card games. They watched movies. On the surface, it seemed like a normal evening between two people getting to know each other. But there were subtle details that stood out. At one point, Lauren left the apartment to briefly meet her brother outside. What did they discuss? Why did she step out? These questions linger because no one knows exactly what was said during that brief encounter. Yet, it remains a critical piece of the puzzle. When Lauren returned, the night continued. But according to LaFontaine, things soon took a concerning turn. He claims Lauren began feeling unwell. She became nauseous and vomited in the bathroom. Was it the tequila? Was there something more? LaFontaine stated that, after getting sick, she simply went to bed. He said she appeared to fall asleep, and he did the same. Hours passed. The quiet of the night gave way to the stillness of dawn. The next morning, LaFontaine awoke to a scene he claims he never expected. Lauren was still, unmoving. Blood was visible around her nose. Unresponsive. He says he tried to wake her, but she didn't respond. Panic set in. That's when he called 911. But even the 911 call left questions. Why, despite the alarming situation, did LaFontaine seem calm, almost detached, according to some interpretations of his account. Why didn't he call for help immediately when she first became ill? Why wait until morning? Was this truly the sequence of events? Or were there details left unsaid? Emergency responders arrived. But it was too late. Lauren Smithfields was pronounced dead at the scene. The story could have ended there, with a tragic explanation and an official report. But instead, it was just the beginning of a series of troubling discoveries, unanswered questions, and a family's desperate search for the truth. What really happened during those hours inside Lauren's apartment? Was the night as uneventful as LaFontaine described? Or is there a missing chapter to this story? What do you think? For Lauren Smithfield's family, the nightmare didn't begin with news from a police officer. It didn't come with a phone call from an official investigator. Instead, it came from a source no family should ever hear such news from, the landlord of Lauren's apartment. More than 24 hours after Lauren had been found unresponsive, her family received the devastating information. No police notification, no explanation, just the cold, crushing realization that their daughter, sister, and loved one was gone. Why weren't they informed immediately? What protocols were or weren't followed? In a case where every second and every detail matters, why did the Bridgeport Police Department fail to do something as basic as notifying a grieving family? But the questions didn't stop there. When Lauren's family entered her apartment, searching for answers the police failed to provide, what they discovered left them stunned. The scene didn't look like it had been thoroughly processed. In fact, what they found raised even more suspicions. There were bloody sheets still on the bed, a used condom left behind, and an unidentified pill resting silently, evidence that the family believed should have been collected, examined, and tested. Yet, according to them, none of these items had been secured by investigators. Why would law enforcement overlook such critical pieces of potential evidence? Were they considered irrelevant? Or worse, simply ignored? The family's frustration deepened when they described the behavior of the detectives assigned to the case. They claimed the police were uncooperative, cold, and dismissive. Questions were met with indifference. Concerns were brushed aside. The family, still in shock, had expected clarity, but instead, they were left with silence. And what about Matthew LaFontaine, the last person to see Lauren alive? Despite being the only known witness to the events of that night, LaFontaine was never treated as a suspect. He wasn't detained for questioning. In fact, he was allowed to leave freely. Some began to wonder, if the circumstances had been different, if Lauren had been someone else, would the investigation have unfolded the same way? The handling of this case didn't just raise eyebrows, it sparked outrage. Many believed the police failed Lauren, her family, and the community. The allegations of negligence weren't just about mistakes, they were about patterns that too often emerge when the victims are black women. Cases overlooked, stories dismissed, lives undervalued. Was this simply an oversight by law enforcement? Or was there a deeper issue at play? Were critical pieces of evidence ignored by accident or by design? What do you think? Did the police intentionally ignore crucial evidence? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. Weeks after Lauren Smithfields was found unresponsive in her apartment, the medical examiner's report was released. It was supposed to provide answers, a definitive conclusion to ease the doubts surrounding her death. But instead, it sparked a new wave of questions, outrage, and disbelief. The official cause of death, an accidental overdose resulting from acute intoxication due to the combined effects of fentanyl, promethazine, hydroxyzine, and alcohol. According to the report, these substances, when taken together, proved fatal. But for Lauren's family, this explanation made no sense. They were adamant. Lauren wasn't a drug user. She wasn't known to experiment with dangerous substances. The presence of fentanyl, a powerful and deadly opioid, raised red flags. How did it end up in her system? Was it taken knowingly, Or did someone else have a hand in what happened that night? Her family's doubts weren't rooted in denial. They knew Lauren. They knew her habits, her choices. This wasn't adding up. The narrative presented by the official report contradicted everything they believed about her. And so they pushed back. They called for an independent investigation, demanding that the case not be closed so easily. To them, this wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a mystery that deserved answers. Answers they weren't getting from the authorities. If Lauren had been unknowingly exposed to fentanyl, who brought it into her apartment? If she had taken it herself, why? And if she hadn't, what really happened that night? As the family's pleas grew louder, so did the voices of the public. The story began gaining traction, spreading across social media, picked up by national news outlets. Hashtags bearing Lauren's name circulated online. People from all over the country began asking the same questions the family had been shouting from the start. Why wasn't this being treated as a potential crime? Why wasn't there more urgency? Journalists, activists, and everyday people rallied behind Lauren's family, demanding transparency and accountability. The spotlight was no longer just on a young woman's tragic death. It was on a system that many believed had failed her. Why did it take public pressure for this case to gain attention? Would the outcome have been different if Lauren looked different? If her background had been different? These were uncomfortable questions, but questions that demanded answers nonetheless. As the media frenzy grew, Lauren's story became more than just a case file. It became a symbol, highlighting the wider issues of racial disparities in investigations, the undervaluing of Black women's lives, and the painful struggle for justice in a system that too often falls short. What do you believe happened that night? Could Lauren's death have been prevented if more care had been taken from the start? Was this truly an accident, or is there more to uncover? The growing outcry could no longer be ignored. Under mounting pressure from the family, the public, and national media coverage, the Bridgeport Police Department made an announcement, one that came far later than many believed it should have. A criminal investigation into the death of Lauren Smithfields would be opened. But was this move driven by genuine pursuit of justice? Or was it merely a response to the voices demanding answers? For many, the timing spoke volumes. As the investigation reopened, attention turned to the officers responsible for handling the case. Chief among them was the detective assigned to Lauren's case, whose actions, or lack thereof, had been at the center of controversy. In a rare move, that detective was suspended. An acknowledgement, perhaps, that mistakes had been made. But for Lauren's family, it wasn't nearly enough. They believed that mishandling the early stages of the investigation had cost them the truth. That crucial hours, days, and evidence were lost. Time that could never be regained. With trust in the police department severely damaged, the family began exploring legal action against the city and the police force. Their fight wasn't just for Lauren, but for the countless others whose cases had been neglected, mishandled, or outright ignored. Would a lawsuit bring accountability? Could legal recourse force institutions to finally treat these cases with the seriousness they deserve? For Lauren's loved ones, the path forward was clear. Justice must be served. But it wasn't just Lauren's family demanding change. The community rose up. In the streets of Bridgeport, protesters gathered, holding signs, chanting Lauren's name, and calling for justice. Petitions circulated online, gaining thousands of signatures. Across social media, influencers and everyday people alike voiced their support, turning Lauren's story into a movement. For many activists, this case symbolized a broader issue. The way cases involving Black women are too often deprioritized, overlooked, and dismissed. Lauren's death had become a rallying cry for reform, demanding better from the systems meant to protect and serve. As the investigation continued, one question loomed large. Would justice be served this time, or would this become just another case buried in bureaucracy and neglect? The community demanded more than just answers. They demanded accountability, transparency, and change. Change not only for Lauren, but for every black woman whose story might otherwise go untold. Now, I want to hear from you. Should independent investigations be mandatory in cases like this? Would a third-party review prevent crucial mistakes and ensure fairness for all victims, regardless of race? In every story like this, one figure inevitably draws attention: the last person known to see the victim alive. In Lauren Smithfield's case, that person is Matthew LaFontaine. But who is he? And why? Despite being the only known witness to the events leading up to Lauren's death, was he never charged? Matthew LaFontaine, a man in his late 30s, working as a design engineer in Connecticut. His life, on the surface, seemed unremarkable. No publicly known criminal record. No reported incidents or suspicious behavior in the past. Just another profile on Bumble, where he and Lauren first connected. But what really stood out wasn't his background. It was his actions after Lauren's death and the statements he gave to investigators. According to LaFontaine, the night seemed ordinary. Drinks, games, a movie. Lauren briefly stepped outside to meet her brother. Then she became sick, vomiting in the bathroom before eventually falling asleep. The next morning, he claimed he found her unresponsive, with blood coming from her nose, and immediately called 911. But were his actions consistent with someone truly unaware of what had happened? LaFontaine cooperated with the police. He answered questions. But there were inconsistencies, small details that didn't sit right with Lauren's family and the public. For instance, why did he reportedly not check on Lauren sooner, especially after seeing her get sick? Why did he only call 911 the following morning, when she was clearly unresponsive? If he had nothing to hide, why did some of his statements raise more questions than they answered? And yet, despite these concerns, authorities chose not to press charges. The official explanation? A lack of evidence. The medical examiner had ruled Lauren's death as an accidental overdose. There were no clear signs of struggle, no immediate proof that a crime had been committed. Without concrete evidence linking LaFontaine to any wrongdoing, the case against him stalled before it could begin. But here's the question: was that enough? In a case where evidence like bloody sheets, a used condom, and an unidentified pill had reportedly been overlooked by investigators, can the absence of evidence truly be trusted? Was this a case of no crime committed, or a crime hidden in plain sight, lost due to early missteps in the investigation? What do you think? Should Matthew LaFontaine have been investigated more thoroughly? Could more have been done to uncover the truth? Or was this truly just a tragic accident with no one to blame? Lauren Smithfield's death raised countless questions, but beyond the personal tragedy, it also ignited a deeper conversation about something far more systemic. Why do so many cases involving black women seem to receive less attention? Why are families often left fighting not only for justice, but to be heard in the first place? This isn't an isolated incident. Across the country, a troubling pattern emerges. Cases involving black women, whether they're missing, murdered, or victims of suspicious deaths, are consistently handled differently. Reports show that disappearances of black women receive less media coverage, fewer resources, and slower law enforcement responses compared to similar cases involving white victims. Families often report feeling dismissed or ignored, forced to conduct their own investigations when authorities fall short. Consider the case of Relisha Rudd, an 8-year-old black girl who went missing in Washington, D.C. The delay in treating her disappearance as critical likely cost precious time. Or Tamla Horsford, whose death during an overnight gathering was ruled an accident despite injuries that many believed warranted further investigation. These stories echo the same frustration: justice delayed, and sometimes denied. But why does this keep happening? Critics argue that systemic issues in law enforcement, from implicit bias to outdated protocols, play a significant role. Many believe that racial bias, whether intentional or not, shapes how cases are prioritized. The result? Communities lose trust, and families like Lauren's are left wondering whether race factored into the lack of urgency. The calls for reform are growing louder. Advocates demand mandatory independent investigations in cases of suspicious deaths. Others are pushing for revised training within police departments to address racial bias head-on. The conversation isn't just about Lauren. It's about changing a system that too often fails Black women when it matters most. So here's a question for you. Do you think racial bias played a role in how this case was handled? If Lauren wasn't a Black woman, would this case have unfolded differently? I want to hear your thoughts. Share your perspective in the comments below. Your voice adds to the conversation that needs to continue. Lauren Smith Fields was a 23-year-old woman with hopes, dreams, and a future ahead of her. But her life came to a sudden and tragic end under circumstances that continue to raise more questions than answers. A date that ended in death. A delayed police response that left her family in the dark. Evidence allegedly overlooked. A used condom, bloody sheets, and an unidentified pill. An autopsy report ruling her death as an accidental overdose, despite her family's firm belief that she wasn't a drug user. And a man, the last person to see her alive, who walked away without charges. Lauren's story is more than a tragedy. It's a call for accountability, for justice, and for systemic change. No family should have to fight for the answers that should have come from the very institutions designed to protect them. If you believe that stories like Lauren's matter, if you think justice should never be selective, then let's keep this conversation alive. Like this video if you believe Lauren deserves answers. Subscribe to stay updated on cases that need more voices demanding justice. And most importantly, share this video so that her story continues to be heard, because awareness brings accountability. So now I leave it to you. What do you think really happened to Lauren Smith Fields? Was this truly just a tragic accident? Or is there more to this story that remains hidden? Let's talk about it in the comments. Your voice matters.